I'm here to help. The light is my strength. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor.
Betrayer of the light.
Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. I'm here to help. A sound plan. For my father, the king. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course.
Betrayer of the light. Our brethren's town is under attack.
Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For Lord Oran. For honor.
Our brethren's
sound
town
plan.
is under attack.
Certainly.
Justice has come. You are past redemption.
A sound plan. For honor.
Justice has come.
A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly.
Betrayer of the light.
Of course. Certainly. For my father, the king. For honor. Certainly. Of course.
You are past redemption.
Certainly. A sound plan.
Justice has come.
Certainly.
Betrayer of the light. Our brethren's town is under attack.
A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For Lord Oran.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Certainly. For my father, the king. A sound plan. Certainly.
Betrayer of the light.
Of course. For my father, the king.
Feel my wrath.
A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For Lord Oran. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For Lord Oran. A sound plan.
Our forces are under attack.
For honor. A sound plan.
Our brethren's town is under
Of
attack.
course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. For my
Our
father,
brethren's
the
town
king.
is under attack.
Of course. Foul days. Certainly.
You are past redemption.
A sound
Our
plan.
town is under attack.
Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For Lord Oran. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
Our hero has been killed.
The light is my strength. For honor. Of course. A sound plan.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Light is my strength.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
A sound. I stand for the light. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Foul. For honor. A sound plan. For honor.
Justice is ours.
Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For my father. I'm here to help you. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan.
An allied hero has been
Of course.
killed. An allied
A
hero
sound
has
plan.
been killed.
For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For Lord Oran. Of course.
Betrayer of the light.
Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. I stand for the light.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Is there danger? A sound plan. Of course. I stand for the light. A sound plan. The light is my strength. Certainly. I stand for the light. I'm here to help. Is there danger? A sound plan. For honor. For my father. A sound plan. Of course. Justice shall be done. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly.
Our
Of
brethren's
course.
town is under attack.
Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan.
Our brethren's town is under
Certainly.
attack.
A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly.
Our forces
honor.
are under attack.
Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor.
Feel my wrath.
A sound plan. For honor.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
For honor. A sound plan.
Foul name.
Of course. Certainly.
Justice has come.
A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
For my father, the king. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
I stand for the light. For honor.
Feel my wrath.
Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Is there danger? Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For Lord Oran.
Our hero has been killed. Our forces are under
Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Light is my strength. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For my father, the king. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Foul name. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course.
allied hero has been
For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course.
betrayer of the light.
Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
I'm here to help. I stand for the light.
Our
sound
forces are
plan.
under attack.
Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Foul pay. For my father, the king.
Betrayal. Our brethren's town is under attack.
For honor.
Our forces are under attack.
Light is my strength. Is there danger? Of course.
Our brethren's
I'm
town
here to
is
help.
under attack.
Justice shall be done. I'm here to help. Certainly. A sound plan. The light is
Our
my
brethren's
strength.
town is under
Of
attack.
course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly.
You are past redemption.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For my father. For honor. A sound plan.
You are past redemption.
Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. I'm here to help. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. For my father, the king. Certainly.
An allied hero has been killed. Betrayer of the light.
A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
Justice has come.
Certainly. For honor.
Foul name.
Of course.
Betrayer of the light.
Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly.
You are past redemption.
For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly.
Feel my wrath.
For honor. Certainly. For honor.
Betrayer of the light.
A sound plan.
Our hero has been killed.
The light is my strength. Of course. For honor. I stand for the light. Certainly. Justice shall be done.
The restless
I'm
dead
here to help.
await.
A sound plan. For honor. I stand for
An
the
allied
light.
hero has been killed.
A sound plan.
Justice has come.
For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly.
Betrayer of the light.
Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor.
You are past death.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly.
Our hero has been killed.
Justice shall be done. For honor. A sound plan. For
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Of course. I stand for the light. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan.
Our brethren's town
For
is under
honor.
attack.
Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor.
Our brethren's town is
A
under
sound
attack.
plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Foul name. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course.
An allied hero has been killed. Betrayer of the light.
A sound plan.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
For honor. Is there danger?
You are past redemption.
Of course.
Our
Certainly.
brethren's town is under
For honor.
attack.
A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Stand for the light. A sound plan.
Our force.
The light is my strength. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor.
An allied hero has been
A
killed.
sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For my father, the king. Certainly.
An allied hero has been killed.
For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan.
Feel my wrath. Justice has come.
For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor.
Can I help you?
I'm here to help. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For Lord. For honor. Justice is come. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Is there danger? Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. The light is my strength. For honor. I'm here to help. Of course. Certainly. Justice shall be done. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. I stand for the light. Of course. Is there danger? A sound plan. Of course. I'm here to help. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. You are past redemption. Of course. A sound plan. About me. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Betrayal of the light. For Lord Oran. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Justice has come. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Betrayer of the light. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. For my father. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For Lord Oran. Justice has come. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Feel my wrath. For honor. Justice. Of course. A sound plan. father. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor.
An allied hero has
Certainly.
been killed.
A sound plan.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Of course. Certainly.
You are past the demo.
Of course. A sound plan.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
For honor. Of course.
An allied hero has
Is there
brethren's
danger?
town is under attack.
For honor. I stand for the light. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Is there danger? A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. I'm here to help. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
Ready for battle.
I stand for the light. Certainly. I'm here to help. Of course. A sound plan. I stand for the light.
Our brethren's
For honor.
town is under attack.
Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For Lord Oran. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor.
Our brethren's town is under attack. An allied hero.
Is there danger? Certainly. For honor.
Allied hero is
Certainly. For my father, the king. Justice has come.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
For Lord Oran. I'm here to help you. Of course. For my father. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. The light is my strength.
Our hero has been killed.
What is your will? Ready for battle.
Justice shall be done. Is there danger? Of course. A sound plan. For honor. I'm here to help. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Justice
Our
shall be
brethren's
done.
town is under attack.
Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
Our brethren's town
For
is
honor.
under attack.
A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly.
Our brethren's town
For
is
honor.
under attack.
Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. I'm here to help. A sound plan.
Our brethren's town is
Certainly.
under attack.
For honor. Is there danger? Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Feel my wrath. For my father, the king.
An allied hero has been killed.
For honor. A sound plan. For honor.
An allied
course.
hero has been killed.
For Lord Iran. Certainly.
Our brethren's town is
Certain.
under attack.
For honor. Of course.
Betrayer of the light. Our hero has been killed. Our brethren's town is under attack.
What is your will?
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Perfect.
I'm here to help. Justice shall be done. A sound plan.
Ready for battle.
I'm here to help.
Our brethren's town
course.
is under attack.
A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly.
What is your will?
Is there danger? For honor. Justice shall be done.
Ready for battle.
A sound plan. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Is there danger? Certainly.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Of course. A sound plan. I stand for the light. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Is there danger? For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly.
Command
Justice
me.
shall be done. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. I'm here to help. Of course. Certainly. The light is my strength. I'm here to help. For honor. Of course. For honor.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Of course. For honor. I stand for the light. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Feel my wrath. Justice is coming. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For Lord Orion. Certainly. Bow. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. You are past death. Of course. Justice is come. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Bow. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor.
Our hero.
What is your will?
An allied hero has been killed.
The light is my strength. Of course. I stand for the light. For honor.
More gold is
The
required.
light is my strength. A sound plan. For honor. A sound... A sound plan.
Our forces are under attack.
A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. sound plan.